Tommy was 2 doors down. Danny Chappie was 3 doors down.
Tommy. What was his nickname?
Tommy Fingers.
And there was another guy in a wheelchair.
Next door, Frankie Wheelchair and Johnny Pinstripe. Hugo, Huge Hugo. Huge Hugo was enormous. My friend, Sammy Honda.
Welcome to Season 2 of the Knife Wife podcast. I'm Suze, here with my husband,
Bob Terzuola.
We're professional creatives and entrepreneurs who live, love, and work together. We share our stories to find ourselves in others. P.S. This podcast has little to do with knives. Hey, everybody. We're back. It's Suze and
Bob, that's me.
We're so glad you're listening. We've been getting lots of comments and emails, and we got our first snail mail fan letter, which, I think I should frame. You can't see it because, this is not a video podcast. I know, Zeke, we're working on it. But it's got a dragon, which is very apropos of Bob, on the front of it, and it says 2024, which is when we started this. And it says, have really enjoyed the podcast. You both are great. Love the personal stories in particular. From Melissa. Well, not everybody has our address, but she has our address, and I have hers because we kind of know her. But anyway, it was still great to get that. I was really excited. More excited than you, huh, Bob?
No, I'm excited too.
Yeah, okay. Anyway, so we're back with more of, questions that nobody asks. I was thinking about this podcast, and, sometimes it's just us, sometimes it's couples, sometimes it's just one person in the couple. And sometimes, it could be anything. Like pretty soon, probably by it will have already aired, we're going to be in Italy, and those are going to be completely random. And I thought, this is such a random podcast that would a random number generator even be able to pick one? And who knows? I don't think we'd even apply. I think they'd go, nah, you're just too random. We still don't have that TikTok dance. So we're going to go into some stories today. But first, we're going to go into some comments and some emails that we got.
The fan mail.
First fan mail. Well, we got that. One of the questions is, what's your favorite snack? And the person's address is Mr. Pringles. I don't know if it's Mr. Pringles. I'm sorry to
say that Pringles is not one of my favorite snacks.
Well, and it's not really a potato chip. Did you know that? They couldn't call it. They had to call them crisps. They're not allowed to call them potato chips because they aren't. They're
I didn't
mashed
know that.
up stuff. But they do come in neat containers that people have all sorts of YouTube videos on what to do with them.
Yeah.
I have to eat them first. But anyway, so what's your favorite snack, Bobby?
My favorite snack that it was really not really a snack. Sometimes it's a full meal. Is Susie's nectarine pie.
Oh,
she makes the best nectarine. But we used to have a peach tree. I think I mentioned this before. In Albuquerque, and she made these beautiful peach pies. And I said one day, I wonder if you could make a nectarine pie. And she said, well, I can't see why not. And she did, and they're absolutely tremendous.
Well, thanks. My favorite snack is candy. I'm not a chocolate lover. I mean, I'll eat chocolate, but I'm not a chocolate lover. Some people are chocoholics. I could live without it. But I walked into the studio today, and there was a bowl of Starburst candies, like for Halloween. I instantly took one.
Wait a minute. Halloween?
Well, they're like in Halloween little fun sizes. And I immediately took one. I'm not really a Starburst lover, but I do love most candy that 5-year-olds love. You'd think I like Starburst more. I like a few flavors. But I like licorice, red licorice. I like Good and Plenty. I like gummy bears. I like the German gummy bears the best. I like just, one of my favorite restaurants in Italy, after it's the restaurant we had our wedding reception in, after you eat your whole dinner and dessert, they come out with these big jars of candy, and not chocolate candy. They come out with the kind of candy I like. Garbage, sugar, fruit flavored. I don't know what they are. Anyway, it's my favorite restaurant, not because of the food, because of the candy. So I think they should serve candy after every meal, but I think
I'm sure we'll be going back there in Milan.
Well, we might. I'd love to take the kids there when we're there because they didn't see where we had our wedding reception. But who knows how it will work out. Anyway, last time we went there with everybody, we met everybody there, remember? We met some of the Ruffiani. Uh-huh. And it wasn't as good as it was billions of years ago when we got married. So I don't know. I don't know if we'll go there. Anyway, okay, so here's the loaded question. Why do they call Bob the Godfather? That's from Eric Miller.
My theory is that because most of them are dyslexic, and it actually should be the dog father.
That's true. You have a shirt that's a play on the Godfather logo that says the dog father with the dog head in it. Mm-hmm. But why do they really call you the Godfather, not the dog father? I think they called you that, A, because you are Italian. 2,
True.
You came from Brooklyn.
True.
And you kind of look like one of Tony Soprano's guys. Whenever you're wearing a Guyabera or a Hawaiian shirt, I'm like, oh, I'm with one of Tony's boys. Yeah. I find that endearing. Anyway, my brother found it. He was freaked out. He's, Mr. Button-Down, Oxford Cloth shirt. And he was like, doesn't he have any other dress shirts? I'm like, but he looks so good in this. And when you wear a Guyabera, that's the bomb. When you had those on with some linen pants, we were at a wedding in Chicago. You look fabulous.
Thank you.
You wear it well. So the also thing is they call this one of his famous knives, is one of his most popular knives ever, the ATCF. I used to call it the OG. When people would want to order a custom one, they wanted the full size. It's a big. How big is the blade on that?
About 4 inches.
Yeah, it's a pretty big blade. And it's a big knife in titanium. And I'd say, oh, Bob, everybody's asking for OGs. And then when we came out with the knife that Fox produced in Italy, we called it the OG. Well, Blade Magazine has it written up as the OG. We've lost the ATCF altogether.
And OG stands for?
Original Gangster.
The Original Gangster.
Bob is so not gangster. Anyway, we got a comment from Tom McSee that said, Bonnie Hunt reminds me of you. She's a serious Cubs fan. And that's the nicest thing anybody ever told me. I'd love to be Bonnie Hunt, and that she reminds, me. I think it should be the other way around, but anyway, it's not. And she was also a Second City girl too. Anyway, she is a serious Cubs fan, and so was her mother and her family, just like mine. It's a sickness. Some people have it from Chicago. Anyway, and one of the comments is going to lead us into the subject for this show today. Someone just wrote, more Brooklyn. Matt C. I don't know who Matt C. is. I can think of 3 of your big collectors named Matt C., but I don't know which one it is. Anyway, so there's, a lot of Brooklyn. I married Brooklyn. I married 100% Brooklyn Italian. And nothing like how I grew up in the North Shore of Chicago. They didn't have any of the same people. They didn't have names. Everyone has nicknames. He'd say, oh, that reminds me of, and you can tell those names later. But anyway, so Bob, tell us about, it's going to be your younger years before you went away to Central America. I think when you were in high school and college is when you had your photographer's job.
Yeah, junior year, senior year, which would have put me about, 20, 21, 22, somewhere around there. So it would have been, 64, 63, 60, somewhere around there.
I was 9.
You were 9. I was in Brooklyn, and I was going to NYU, and I lived at home. I didn't go to a dormitory or anything.
Why would you?
Why would
you eat that food when you have your mother and father's cooking?
Exactly, yeah. So I'd get on the train every day, and take the train back. And I had gotten a scholarship to NYU, so we really couldn't afford for me to go to college otherwise. And I certainly couldn't have afforded the dormitory and everything else. Mm-hmm. But living in Brooklyn, the train was fairly convenient. I was able to do that. So I was living at home, and I had several little jobs that I would do. I had friends in the neighborhood.
Yeah, let's talk about your neighbors for a moment.
Which neighbors?
So you had one neighbor, Tommy. What was his nickname?
Tommy Fingers.
When you first said that, I thought, oh, he's a criminal. He's a pickpocket.
No, he was not a pickpocket. Tommy Fingers, his name was Tommy Marino, actually. He lived 2 doors down. And he had lost 3 fingers working on the trains in the transit authority, the subway. Mm. And he was a really nice guy. He was not a criminal. He was one of the few guys that probably were not connected very much in my neighborhood. Although it was a pretty nice neighborhood.
connected? Were they like plug into the wall connected? What do you mean connected?
Connected means you've got friends who are kind of in nefarious businesses. Connected with the gangs and so forth. He wasn't. He was a good man. He was a good guy.
Yeah. And there was another guy in a wheelchair.
That was Frankie. Frankie Wheelchair. He our chief engineer is laughing over here. I hope he doesn't press the wrong button. Don't press the wrong button. Let me back up a little bit. I through a friend of mine, Dom Denaro, who had a photographic printing place. Processing. Yeah,
Color.
he did color photo processing, and I worked with him for the summers, and I'd go in and help process the color prints that he would make for weddings and bar mitzvahs and so forth. And one day he
in your neighborhood there were weddings or bar mitzvahs. That was
weddings and bar mitzvahs.
That was it. I mean, I was there. I saw on one side of the street the Italian women with full makeup, high heels, dressed to the nines, and then on the other side were the Orthodox Jews with their wigs and their heads covered. And I was like, oh, there's my people. Yeah. Anyway, so that's all you had in your neighborhood.
So he processed photographs for weddings and bar mitzvahs. Believe it or not, a couple of funerals that I remember also. But
funerals of the body.
Well, open coffin, closed coffin. Yeah, I mean they had people just wanted remembrances of the.
They couldn't get any photos while they were breathing.
Because sometimes, just to make sure they weren't breathing. Yeah. Sometimes you'd have these enormous families, both Jewish or Italian, and the only time they would say the only time we get together is weddings and funerals.
Well, that's true of a lot of people.
But anyway, Dom Denaro, who was running this place, one day he shows up with a little Honda 50, with the smallest Honda.
Back up. I want to back up a bit. Tell us about when you work for Dom, the thing you invented for him for his photography. Let's stay in the photo job for 1 minute before you jump to your next job.
Really?
Yeah, it's a fascinating story, if you can describe it.
Dominic Denaro specialized in processing color prints. And this is the early 60s, remember. It wasn't very common to do color prints, especially in a small storefront shop.
And your father used to color prints, and we had them. We had a picture of my brother, who's your age, where they colored it, and it looks like he's a drag queen in it. It's terrible.
Yeah, he used to color them by hand, yeah. But anyway, the color prints, and it was a very complicated process. Required 7 chemicals that were in large tanks, rectangular tanks. Had to be done in absolute darkness. You couldn't have any light at all. It wasn't like black and white with a red light. You have no light at all. And he was doing basically only 2 prints at a time, dipping them into these tanks back to back with a pair of tongs in the dark. And I invented for him a large basket. And it's a little bit complicated to explain it, but it was rectangular, made of plexiglass, and it had a top section and a bottom section that you could flip it over. And the top and bottom sections were divided with a window screen, plastic window screen, so the chemicals could all pass through and everything. And I passed that window screen back and forth and back and forth and back and forth from one end of the box to the other, so that 2 prints back to back could be slid down into the pockets that were formed between the screens. So we were able to do 32 prints in once instead of the 2 prints at a time.
Wow.
So he offered me the job of doing it. I said, thanks a lot. And okay, so.
Yeah, because he asked you if you could think of anything, why anyone's asking a kid your age to do that. Yeah. I guess you must have sort of stood out at the time. Nobody asked me anything like that, let me tell you.
So these were 7 tanks, and most of it had to be done in absolute darkness and so forth. So I did that. But one day, Dominic shows up with a Honda 50, which is the smallest. It kind of looks like what should I say? Almost like a Vespa, like the Italian, scooters type of thing. A little bit bigger, not very much. And I said, wow, that's really cool. I said, where'd you get that? And he said, my friend, Sammy Honda. Sammy's down the block. He was,
Honda.
Sammy Honda. His name was Sam Cardinale. And he had a place just 3 blocks from my father's house called Cardinal Motors. And he sold Hondas mainly, but he had a couple of Harleys there also. He was a real Harley fan.
What was he like? Was he a big guy? Was he a biker-looking guy?
He was really, really handsome. Very handsome. Very Italian. He had long, wavy, gray hair. He was, I don't know, prematurely gray. I'd say he probably no more than the late 30s, but he was a nice-looking guy. I'm sure he was connected. He knew people because he had motorcycle parts coming in and out of that shop and back and forth, and people would come in and, they'd have motorcycle parts from who knows where they got them. So Dominic introduced me to Sammy Honda, and I went down there. I was going to buy myself a bike. And where did I get the money from? Well, you remember, I was in college at the time. I wasn't making very much money at Dominic's. But the state of New York, in their great generosity, was
their
giving
socialism.
me, I earned what was known as a Regents Scholarship. This is separate and different from the scholarship that sent me to NYU.
Mm-hmm.
This was a Regents Scholarship because of the marks that I got on the Regents exams at the end of high school. They were comprehensive exams at the end of high school. They called them the Regents exams. Everybody had to take them. And they had, it was like a 3-hour exam for each subject, English, mathematics, science, history, and so forth. And you had to go down to the school in the middle of June. We had no air conditioning in those days, remember?
Mm-hmm.
And take these 3-hour exams. And because I did very well on them, they gave me $500 a semester for all the semesters that I was in college.
Which was supposed to be used for books or with the transportation.
Yeah.
Because your other scholarship was from the Hebrew Institute of Technology or something?
Hebrew Technical Institute. Yeah, that was NYU.
And because you scored so high on those tests, that's how you got that full ride, right?
Yeah, there were 4 of us that did that.
Yeah.
So anyway, I had this check that was burning a hole in my pocket, so I went down. I was going to buy one of these Honda 50s. And Sammy Cardinale, he was one of those guys, tough, very tough, good looking, like I said, but really tough, probably connected, but he had a heart of gold.
He reminds me, when I think of him, is of Bobby Cardinale, the actor, the tall guy. He was in Vinyl. He was in he was in The Sopranos too.
Carnivale. Bobby Cannavale.
That's who I think of when I think of this guy.
Yeah. And he had a heart of gold. And he looked at me and said, you're a pretty big guy. He said, the Honda 50 is not a bike for you. He said, you should go at least one step bigger. So I got the Honda 160. And I rode that around, went to school in it and so forth. My friend Kevin bought one also. And Sammy offered me a job. He said, when you're not working with Dominic, he said, why don't you come over here and, watch the shop for me and maybe sell some motorcycles. And now that you're a bike rider, come on and maybe sell some bikes and make a commission on them. I said, okay. So I would hang around there and sell them.
And what kind of guys came in there? I mean, who are these guys? You told me there was like a group. I think I call them the original Ruffiani.
No, these guys weren't Ruffiani.
No?
Most of the people that bought bikes.
No, I don't mean the bike buyers. I mean the people that hung around with Sammy Honda.
Yeah, well, Sammy Honda's place was kind of a converted garage shop type of thing, like a mechanic shop, so forth. He had a big roll-up door and so forth. Next door was Frankie Wheelchair and Johnny Pinstripe. And they had another shop like his, the mechanic shop and so forth. But what they did, as the name might imply, they did auto body work. Frankie Wheelchair was really good at it. He couldn't reach everything on the big cars, but on dents on the sides and so forth, he was really, really good. He became crippled. I think he was shot in the spine. when he was younger. He was about 35 years old.
And who shot? Was he in the war? Why did he get shot in the spine?
No, it was a gang thing in Brooklyn, so forth. And Johnny Pinstripe, this guy was just absolutely amazing. His long hair, really tough looking. He wore jeans and ratty old T-shirts and stuff. But this guy could paint a pinstripe on a car from the taillight to the headlight in an absolutely straight line, and then end it with all of the curlicues and arrowheads and pointed things, and just amazing, all with a brush. He did it all with a brush. I guess you could call him an artist. He was an artist. But he was, these were some of the colorful people in the neighborhood. Frankie Wheelchair and Johnny Pinstripe they were well known in the neighborhood right around there.
Yeah. Who else? So the guy who owned the photography processing place, he hung around with Sammy Honda.
Huge Hugo was a friend of Dominic. Dominic was in the Korean War, and he had 3 or 4 guys that were with him in Korea.
Mm-hmm.
And they all kind of hung out together. There was a neighborhood, you could call it a gang, but they weren't criminal gangs. They were just, they would hang out on the street corners and talk and stuff like that, Dee was one of his friends.
Just Dee.
Carpenter.
Mm-hmm.
And construction guy. And he did some really nice work. He helped me a lot he taught me a lot about carpentry and fixing things up. Huge Hugo was enormous. He was, you couldn't believe how big this guy was. I mean, he looked like anybody who's old enough would remember the name Haystacks Calhoun, who was a wrestler from the 1950s. This guy was enormous. He was Italian.
Mm-hmm.
He had hands that looked like Virginia hams. They were just, you couldn't believe this guy, how big he was. The sweetest, most gentle guy you'd ever want to meet.
Mm.
So what did Hugo do for a living? He worked in a job shop.
What's a job shop?
Job shop is it's like a machine shop where they do specific jobs for companies, for people. They don't do the same thing over and over again. They'll do different types of jobs. Mm-hmm. And it was a machine shop. And what he specialized in was making carbide burrs. Now, carbide burrs are like little rotary files. They come in different shapes, maybe the size of a pea or smaller if they're round. Sometimes they're flame-shaped.
And you would use them in like a Dremel tool or
put them in a Dremel tool.
Screwdriver, electric screwdriver or something.
Or the kinds of things that dentists use also, really small. Hugo would grind the flutes in these things, the cutting edges, in these tiny little burrs, like I said, the size of a pea, sometimes the size of a match head, with his hands, and he'd rotate them on the grinder, these sharpened grindstones made of diamond. And he was able to make, he'd look at me and he said, you want some of these? I said, how many flutes do you want? 26, 28? You want right hand, left hand? And he was just amazing with his hands, and you never would have guessed it looking at him. Just enormous. So
that helped you because you were carving jade back then, right?
Yeah, I was trying to use them for jade, but I use them for other things too. Any kind of metal. I still have many of them. Hugo used to give me a whole bunch of them. I still have many that I use in my knife making. Yeah.
Pretty amazing. They're still.
Yeah. These are all the neighborhood guys,
Yeah. Well, you had a next door neighbor. You had besides Tommy Fingers, you had another neighbor that had a car business.
It wasn't a car business. Tommy was 2 doors down. Danny Chappie was 3 doors down.
Was that his real name?
His name was Danny Chaparino. Well, we called him Danny Chappie.
Danny Chappie.
Danny Chappie, yeah. He and his father both worked for the post office. And they were both real crooks. Both of them were crooks.
Wow.
One of the things Danny would do every once in a while, didn't do it very often, but every once in a while, he'd go to a junkyard and get a fairly late model car that was junked, engine failing or something like that, and he'd bring it into his garage in the driveway, 3 doors down from our house. And then he'd go and rent a car of the same model. and he'd switch engines. He'd take it over the weekend. He put the rental car engine into the other one, and he'd drive it back and turn it in. And he'd have this old junker car with a practically a brand new engine, And that's how he made his money for a while.
Did he ever get caught? Did Hertz ever, or whoever he rented him from, say, "Hey, wait a minute, this isn't the engine that should be in this car. It's got way too much wear and tear on it"?
I don't know. I never heard that he ever got arrested or anybody ever got onto it. Maybe. I'm not sure.
Okay. Wow. Well, my neighbors where I grew up, they owned car dealerships. There was nothing like that. It was a little different. So I would be fascinated. They should do you should write a book about your neighborhood, all your different neighbors.
They probably could. Now, Danny and his father, I told you they worked for the police, not the police, the post office. And every 4th of July, I'm not sure how they got them, but I think they got them from confiscated material. They would bring home firecrackers, and they would set off firecrackers for the 4th of July. Mm-hmm. Now, most people will set off one firecracker, sometimes a pack. The pack would be,
the little ones.
A pack was
144.
No, the small packs. I think they were 12 and 12, maybe 24. Mm-hmm. People would set them off, And then they had what they called a mat, which was 144 packs. Multiply that, I don't know how many comes in, a lot. And they'd bring out 20 or 30 of these mats, and they'd set them off. And the next morning, it looked like the street, that they had snowed in the street. There'd be, 2 or 3 inches of this white firecracker paper all over the place. The dogs would go crazy. The animals were crazy, But I don't know. I never knew where they got them from, but they never paid for anything.
I would think so. Yeah, it reminds me of when we were in Guatemala. The first night we were in Guatemala, and I didn't know that in Guatemala people set off fireworks, like if it's somebody's birthday or a special occasion, or I don't know, I think just to do it. But the first night I woke up and I thought it was gunfire, and I woke you up and I said, "Bob, listen, is that gunfire?" He goes, "Nah, it's somebody with a mat of firecrackers." Well, you have much more experience in this than I do.
Just firecrackers.
It's just firecrackers. Go back to sleep, Susie. Anyway, so you're working at Sammy Honda's shop.
I sold a couple of motorcycles. I didn't sell many. It wasn't a big deal.
Yeah, I don't see you as a high pressure salesman kind of guy.
But 2 things about Sammy. One, I said he had a heart of gold.
Mm-hmm.
I was going out on a date with my first girlfriend at the time, and I told him I was going to take the bike. She wasn't going to ride with me because it was going to be drizzling out. There were a group of us, and she was going to ride in a car with 2 or 3 other friends. We were going down on Shore Road on the Belt Parkway. There was a place called Nellie Bly, and Nellie Bly was like a little amusement park. It was putt-putt golf and a little Ferris wheel and hot dogs and little things like that. It wasn't a big one. It was a kiddie place, but we used to like to hang around there. It was fun. We had to go down on the highway, and Sammy told me. He looked at me. He said, "Do you have a helmet?" I said, "No, I haven't gotten. I couldn't afford a helmet. These were pretty expensive at the time." So he said, "Never ride your bike, especially on the highway, without a helmet." And he gave me his helmet. Now, he was a racer. He used to race motorcycles.
So it was a racing helmet?
It was a full-size Bell helmet, full covering, not a half helmet, a full one. And it was painted toxic green, kind of fluorescent toxic green. I'll never forget it. So I wore the helmet, and sure enough, I didn't know enough to not ride in the center of the lane with a motorcycle, because the center of the lane is where the oil and grit from cars' engines kind of builds up, as opposed to the sides where the tires kind of keep the lane a little bit clean from all that. And it was drizzling just a little bit, so it made for a very slick section in the middle. And I didn't know very much. This was my first time out. I was, stupid. And
inexperienced.
So I dumped the bike. This was on the Belt Parkway. And I was doing probably 40 miles an hour or something like that. And I did have a heavy jacket on. I didn't get hurt, except when I got up, I looked at the helmet, and the back of the helmet had a gouge from the crown to the edge about a half an inch deep. And that would have been my head. And I wouldn't be here today if I didn't have Sammy Honda's helmet on.
Well, thank you, Sammy Honda.
Thank you, Sammy Honda.
Yeah, he did a lot of good things. Like there was a man who, you can tell us more about Charlie. You told the story once on the USN forums, and everybody loved this story. And we tried to find it, but we couldn't find it again. So you'll have to recall that story about one of the people he took care of, because he took care of people.
I wrote it on the USN, as I remember, wasn't it? Is that where it was? Yeah. Sammy had this shop where he would sell the motorcycles, and in the back was a little mechanic shop. He would do some repairs, or he had some guys come in and do repairs. They put the bike up and, change the oil or tighten things up and so forth. And he had this fella who would come in the afternoon. His name was Charlie. We never knew his last name. And Charlie was probably a mute, but he never said a word, never talked. He was obviously
mentally challenged.
Well, I'm not sure what word to use. Mentally challenged. Who knows? I'm not a politically correct person. Who cares?
Well, back then, with all the names of everybody, all the nicknames, there was no political correctness. Today, those names, people would be massacred for those names.
So Charlie was tall, very, very thin, and he always wore a wool army greatcoat, the kind of coat that went down past your knees. It was like a big overcoat. They called it a greatcoat. It was an old army surplus, and it was wool, and he wore it even in the summertime.
My father had one from World War II, and I wore that to school when I was in high school. They're wool. They're warm. It was really warm in Chicago. Yeah. So, and he couldn't believe I would wear that, but
I couldn't believe it either. Anyway, Charlie did, and Charlie would do things like sweep the floor, clean the windows. He didn't do a very good job cleaning windows, but he took a stab at it. And Sammy would give him a couple of bucks, make sure he had some food. And there was a room way in the back where he would let Charlie sleep if Charlie would wanted to. He wasn't always there. And it was just like an old mattress bed, not very much. It had a sink in it. It was kind of like a storeroom way in the back. It had its own door and everything. And Charlie would come in, and then he'd be there for 2 or 3 days and sweeping, or he'd work in the shop in the back. Now Charlie had a talent that Sammy could take advantage of, and that was welding. Charlie could weld anything, and he was really good. And I once saw him weld a gas tank while it was still on the motorcycle. It welded a hole in it. I said, Sammy, aren't you afraid he's going to blow the damn shop up? He's welding. He's got the torch over the gas tank. And Sammy said, don't worry, he knows what he's doing. He filled the tank up with water first. I said, oh, okay. So he knew what he was doing. Anyway, Charlie could weld anything. He was really good at it. And he'd come in, and then he'd disappear for weeks at a time. He'd come back, just walk in the door, pick up the broom, and start sweeping. And I, talk to him and just, tell him stories or talk about the neighborhood. And he would listen, but he would never say anything, never talked back and so forth. And he went away for a while, and I talked to Sammy, and one day Sammy said, Charlie hasn't been here in months. He says, I'm not sure he's ever coming back. And sure enough, Charlie never came back. And we never knew what happened to him. But about a week after that, Sammy called me over. He was in the shop in the back. He called me. He said, Bob. They were calling me Bob at that time.
Rob or Bob?
No, Bob.
Bob.
Yeah.
Okay.
They called me Bob. He said, Bob, come over here. I want to show you something. And we went in the back to where Charlie used to sleep. And there was this big tarpaulin, obviously over a motorcycle. He pulled off the tarpaulin, and he said, this was Charlie's. He brought it in here one day a couple of years ago, and he never rode it. He pulled the tarpaulin off, and there was a British Vincent Black Shadow motorcycle. Absolutely gorgeous, mint. It was one of the most beautiful bikes I'd ever seen. The Vincent Black Shadow. That was the same motorcycle that Lawrence of Arabia was killed on after World War I. But that belonged to Charlie, and Sammy Honda never sold it. As far as I know, he kept it there.
Wow.
Till he sold the shop years later.
Well, you Italians are pretty sentimental people.
Yeah.
You are.
Yeah.
You really are. Anyway, well, thanks for sharing all those stories, honey. I love these stories. There'll be more. We'll have more Brooklyn. There's lots of Brooklyn, lots of years in Brooklyn. Unbelievable characters, that are like...
they weren't unbelievable. They were real. They were there. They were my friends.
Okay, but today you don't see those kind of people. You don't have those kinds of neighborhoods. Everybody pulls in their garage and shuts the door. It's not the same as those days where people lived on their front porches and said hello and walked places.
Yeah. It's a much diminished society, I believe.
Well, I don't know if that's it, but it certainly has changed a lot.
Yeah.
And so I love hearing those stories. Anyway, so everybody, thanks for listening.
Next time I'll tell you about the Greek baker next door to Dom.
Oh, that's a great story. You have such a good heart. Oh, I know. Maybe I wanted to ask you one question before we close. You were with all these people who did nefarious things in your neighborhood. I mean, the neighborhood was checkered with criminals. How did you stay on the straight and narrow? Why did you stay on the straight and narrow?
Because I realized most of those guys were stupid.
Do you have any strong opinions about them?
If they were real, most of them weren't really criminals. Maybe Danny Choppy was, and his father. But the other guys, they do the penny ante stuff, little things. And they were just scraping to get along, and some of them had real talent, like Frankie and Johnny Pinstripe,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Frankie Wheelchair, Johnny Pinstripe. I think I should do some drawings of these guys.
Sammy Honda.
And do his T-shirt for all your fans, because they love these stories too. So anyway, well, all right. Now we're going to close. Thanks, everybody, again.
Thanks for being here.
And we'll see you next time. And keep those cards. We have a card. And letters come in the comments and everything on Terzuola.net or at TheKnifeWife podcast on Instagram. We'll see you later.
Arrivederci.
Ciao. Thanks for listening. If you like what you're hearing, please share this with a friend and subscribe where you listen to podcasts. Support our efforts through Patreon at TheKnifeWife, and for all Terzuola goodness, go to Terzuola.net. And remember, if you're not laughing, you're not living. Comments and questions can be made on Instagram at TheKnifeWife Podcast or our Facebook group, The Knifewife Podcast. And if you're a couple who work together and would like to be on our podcast, tell us about yourself with an email at eccentricsues.com or Terzuola.net.